Hello, my name is Brant Hunt, and I have a channel here called Discerning What is True. Today is the 14th day of February 2023. Um, we're going to be going through a book that I started a couple of days ago called America's Engineer Decline. Chapter 2 is what I'm going to be reading from. And the book I have here is by William Norman Grigg, Grigg. He's written a couple books, but he has passed away also. This is a book he did probably back in early 2000s, as well as I recollect. Um, he was a writer for the New American Magazine with the John Birch Society. I briefly was involved with the John Birch Society back in I guess it was basically the 1990s somewhere, actually probably late 1990s, actually, and was involved with that. I began to see some things that didn't make sense to me, and I actually was involved with called Augusta chapter when I lived in Augusta, Georgia. But I began to see things that just didn't make sense, and I didn't see basically the whole issue where they were just making let's get out of UN. Um, but anyway, you live and learn. That's what you do in life. Um, and I threw in that particular deal. And a few years later, I was involved with the Constitution Party, which I began to figure that out. Not a bad people. That's not it, folks. It's just that basically, um, it isn't about politics, folks. It's about truth. It's what it's all about. Politics will never solve the problem, never will, no matter what political party you see. So let's get into the book here again by William Grigg. Um, Thank you for being here. My channel, Discerning What is True, is also on YouTube. And so the chapter is named Businesses. The quote here is from Ludwig von Mises. I don't know if you know who this guy is, but he's a famous Austrian economics entrepreneur, not an entrepreneur, but a teacher. Um, they have a school in Dallas, in Auburn, Alabama, and the trial has been held. The businessman has been convicted. The crime will be announced as a suitable occasion. Chapter 2. We lost our steel industry already, and we have virtually lost a big chunk of the automobile industry. And so now the government is working very, very hard to try to lose the chemical industry and the paper industry and the metal industry. I think their energy policy is set up so that it will drive Americans out of their businesses. It just breaks my heart. But little by little, we've shifted and brought and moved businesses to where they are user friendly. The government has always been antagonist towards industrial businesses in America. This is a quote from chemical magnate John M. Huntsman, Huntsman. In 1933, when Adolf Hitler's National Socialist Party came into power in Germany, the result was that what leftist historians stated, William Shirer, Shirer, called a Niagara of thousands of special degrees, and laws. So vast was the number of these enactments, and so opaque was the bureaucratic jargon in which they were written, that even the most astute businessman was often lost, and special lawyers had to be employed to enable the firm to function. German citizens were hard pressed to learn all the laws, let alone obey them. Although the United States of America is decidedly not Hitler's right, that is, America's particular businessmen are caught up in a remarkable similar regulatory web. If, as the ancient Roman statesman Cicero maintained, free societies are defined by the existence of a relatively small number of clear, easily understood laws, then the United States is much clearer, that is much closer to Hitler's tyranny than the Republican idea to which our founders aspired. Yeah, it's more and more regulations, there's more and more legalese, and there are more and more statutes that actually that's what laws do, folks. They steal your freedom. They actually destroy freedom. You see, It's very basic, you see. But they, as lawyers, like to make laws, you see. We are a nation of lawbreakers, lament a Wall Street Journal front page story more than a decade ago. Nearly all of people violate some laws, and many people run afoul of dozens of others without ever being considered or consider themselves to be lawbreakers. The result of this proliferation of laws, including bureaucratic enactments that are enforced as if they were laws, is that Americans are left in a state of perpetual insecurity, since laws that are often broken with impunity make it difficult for people to predict the consequences of their actions. Each year, literally thousands of new regulations are emitted by the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Treasury, the Department of Agriculture, the Housing and Urban Development, and the Interior Department, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and so on, so on. And as the regulatory leviathan grows, it increasingly sucks up revenue, resources, and manpower that otherwise would be invested in productive pursuits, thereby driving an increasing number of businessmen and investors offshore. Many, perhaps even most, of the U.S. businesses that relocate production offshore are run by people who would prefer to keep the work here at home. Some companies, such as Wisconsin-based engine manufacturer Briggs & Stratton, had actually done battle with the regulatory bohemian in the interest of saving jobs in this country. In September 2003, Briggs & Stratton, that is, a company which produced small engines such as those found in lawnmowers and generators, tried to beat back a regulatory assault that would have cost tens of thousands of Americans their jobs. The California state government proposed a new pollution standard requiring small engine manufacturers to put catalytic converters, what the fuck, on their motors beginning in 2020. We could not do that economically here, protested Briggs & Stratton Senior Vice President Tom Savage, S-A-V-A-G-E, warning that retooling to meet the standards would probably result in outsourcing the work overseas. That warning caught the ear of Wisconsin Senator Herbert Kohl, K-O-H-L. Although a liberal Democrat, Kohl also relies heavily on the support of blue-collar industrial voters in a state whose manufacturing base has been radically eroded over the past decade. Accordingly, Kohl suddenly displayed an unusual for him, that is, skepticism regarding the value of environmental regulations. In this economy in which 2.5 million manufactured jobs have been lost, including 75,000 in Wisconsin, regulations that will force more jobs overseas need additional scrutiny, Kohl declared. The impact of the envisioned outsourcing by Briggs & Stratton that have been felt in nearly half the states of our union. According to a study released by the company, 23,000 jobs in 24 states would be lost were the new standard to be imposed by California. And the relocation would have an impact far beyond the company's payroll. California is attempting to impose unreasonable standards that force us to consider moving operations overseas. And this would have a tremendous impact not only on our workers, but on our suppliers and customers. That is the company again, Vice President Thomas Savage explained. Savage further noticed that Briggs is one of the last remaining U.S. manufacturers of small engines, and we're doing everything we can do to keep good high-tech manufacturing jobs from moving overseas. This including making a counter proposal to the California Air Resources Board that would reach a level of emissions reduction comparable to CARB owns proposal, but without all the high costs and the potential jobs losses. Unfortunately, Briggs' attempt at conciliation also includes supporting a congressional measure promoting a uniform national emission standard set by EPA. A patchwork of state laws would make large-scale engine manufacturers nearly impossible. Rather than solving the company's problem in California, this measure would simply spread the misery nationwide and set the stage for future regulatory impositions that would drive even more companies to outsource to work abroad. Yes, it's all been done, folks. This is done on purpose, all of it. Briggs & Stratton succeeded in getting a U.S. Senate committee to block implementations of the California Air Quality Rule. This prompted the Clean Air Trust, a prominent member of the huge foundation-funded establishment of environmental lobbies, to demand the Securities and Exchange Commission investigate the company for supposedly misrepresenting its financial status in an official report. In a filing with the SEC, Briggs said that it did not believe the proposed California Air Quality Rule will have a material effect on its financial condition or results of operation. Senator Dianne Feinstein, Democrat from California, a proponent of the proposed rule, piece of shit, denounced Briggs for his unsavory tactics. They're either not telling the truth, you should know that, in their SEC filings, or they are not telling the truth to the American people, especially the Senate. This is how these people work, folks. This is how they work. They see themselves above reproach, but yet they themselves are just as much of a hypocrites as anybody else is. In fact, Einstein and her eco-radical allies, in their eagerness to punish Briggs-Stevens for impeding the regulatory juggernaut, were engaged in deliberate misrepresentation. The company didn't stand to lose money if it relocated the jobs offshore. The issue was the financial health of the company's American workers, not the company itself. Can Briggs and Stratton live with California proposal regulations? Yes, observed Ernie Blazer, a spokesman for Senator Kit Bond, Republican Missouri. But that would require moving almost 2,000 good paying jobs from Missouri to other countries. We never said that we would lose money. We never said that is our filings with the SEC, explained Briggs Vice President Savage. What we said is this California action would have terrible effects on the employees. This episode offers a revealing glimpses of the process that has led many American companies to outsource their products production abroad. Too often, news coverage of such corporate decisions is designed to portray the corporate leaders as greedy, unpatriotic opportunists who are clinically indifferent regarding the welfare of their employees. More often than not, however, these decisions are driven by government policies that make it economically impossible for companies to remain in the United States. Indeed, the Briggs and Stratton episode illustrates that government overregulation of business is the single largest impediment to economic competitiveness. You have to, and I'm going to say this, I'm going to ask this question. I've been at Home Depot. Last year, I bought a lawnmower. I've actually owned 3 lawnmowers, and actually one was actually a John Deere push lawnmower that was made by, the engine was made by Kawasaki. And then since then, I've owned 2 Honda lawnmowers, and they've been all gas. And I bought it last year because the other lawnmower was pretty much on its last legs. And I've had it since 2002 or 3, which is that's over 20 years, folks, almost 20 years. Had a good report with it. I still have it, but the body part of it is not holding up, but it still starts, you see. So, so I went to buy one, and there are not many gasoline engines, lawnmowers being made anymore here in this country, folks. They're not going to be. They're going to be outlawed. Everything's going to go electric. Because nothing's going to work without electric. These people are the fuckingest, stupidest people on this planet. We have people who don't know a damn thing about industry whatsoever. They're making rules that are destroying this country. And to me, it's basically a very socialistic proposals that's happening. Look at people, what they make now. It's all their fault. It is their fault for this, folks. It isn't always other things. It's these proposals, these economic things, also to do with what we're going back 100 years ago when Woodrow Wilson decided to not import, to create. We could solve this fucking problem very quickly. We would start to charge import taxes and get away from this fucking free trade shit. Because there's no such thing as free trade, folks. Never has. It's a lie from the pit of hell. And so what happens simply is now you allow other companies to come in here and sell their products, but their companies don't make it here. You assemble it here, yes, but it's assembled. And I believe the plant that Honda has here is assembled. I don't think they actually make the lawnmower engines here. I think they're made in Japan. Well, who knows? They may be in China now. The West is killing itself, folks. It's destroying its whole self. And people say, oh, it's a pollution, this and that. That's bullshit. That's all fucking bullshit. They've completely brainwashed people these days that saying pollution's bad when in reality, the quote unquote, the plants, the trees, take in what we call carbon dioxide and produce oxygen. You see, we lived on a perfect planet here, but we have people who destroy life in a lot of ways, you see. But anyway, It also is very instructional to note the reaction provoked by Briggs and Stratton's refusal to play by the deceptive script. For fighting on behalf of his employees, the company was threatened with a bogus SEC investigation, a potential corporate death sentence in the post-Enron era. But this is actually fairly typical of the behavior of the federal regulatory leviathan, which often seems to have been given the task of job extermination as its prime directives. Yes. The regulatory burden. H. Ross Perot memorably described low wage rates abroad as creating a giant sucking sound, the metaphoric sound of industrial jobs being drawn abroad while low wages rates suck U.S. jobs overseas. The ever-growing quality of federal regulations pushes them abroad just as vigorously. Yeah, our fucking government is the fucking problem. And if you don't like what I say, I'm sorry. You know, I'm tired of these fuckers lying all the time. You should be angry about it too. We used to make radios in this country. We used to make televisions in this country. We used to make a lot of things. We used to make cars in this country, folks. That's almost gone. We used to make a lot of things in this country, but we sure have messed up in the last 50 years, if not longer. And no one seems to be concerned about it. And this hogwash that this stupid fucking president, Mr. Biden, lies about all this stuff that there was actually 500,000 jobs created last month or last whatever it was. I think it was in December. Is bullshit. They're liars. It's particularly staggering that $6,957 per employee, that is, in 2003, thousands of new state laws, many of them intended to carry out federal mandates, went into effect, 1,000 of them in California alone. In 1996, the year Congress passed the Red Tape Reduction Act, the estimated cost of regulatory compliance for small business was $700 billion annually. In 2003, 7 years after the small business relief package was passed amid great fanfare, that figures have risen to $860 billion, or 8% of our gross domestic product. The Federal Register, which complies the regulation issued every single day by federal regulatory agencies, expanded to 75,606 pages. Compare that total with 9,562 pages in 1950. That was 20,000 in 1970. And in 1990, it was 49.79 thousand. They just keep writing stuff. Just keep writing all kinds of regulatory agencies. You know, this people just paperwork. These are people who work in the government, folks. They don't know how to run a government. They don't know how to run a business. They don't even know how to run a government. I've been in this kind of business. I've seen what's happened, folks. They destroyed this country in the last 20 years immensely. But it's all of this actually has been going on for 50 years too. It should be noted that the register is formulated in a double column pages filled with small type, and each page is generated by executive branch bureaucrats. That's all it is bureaucrats whose pronouncement precisely have the force of law. How odious is this accumulated body of regulations? Consider this. Several U.S. businessmen who have launched enterprises in communist China told a financial commentator that it is much easier to start a business in China than in the United States, especially in places like Massachusetts and California. Those are the two, probably with New York and Illinois, are probably the four most liberal states in the country. And even when aspiring entrepreneurs succeed in starting business, the crush of regulations often makes it difficult to run a profit. This is particularly true even if the cost of regulations are passed on to the consumers, as they inevitably are. Many critics have insist that the trends is a reflection of corporate greed and pathetic foreign wages. However, as a study compiled by the National Association of Manufacturers documents, the federal regulatory burden is the single most important factor behind the exodus of jobs from the U.S. Our own government is destroying its own way of actually collecting taxes. The stupid idiots. U.S. manufacturing has demonstrated the ability to overcome pure wage differential with trading partners through invocation, capital investment, and productivity. Comments James Berges, B-E-R-G-E-S, president of Emerson. a St. Louis-based manufacturer of industrial equipment. When the additional external costs of federal regulation are piled on, the task becomes unmanageable, even in the best companies. Simply put, many or even most American businesses who relocate abroad aren't abandoning our nation. They are fleeing socialism. Using a standardized measurement called unit labor costs, the NAM reports compares U.S. industrial competitiveness with that of 9 biggest trading partners, that is Canada, Mexico, Japan, China, Germany, Britain, South Korea, Taiwan, and France. This approach allowed researchers to calculate government-imposed structural costs on manufacturing in each country. According to the report, domestic imposed costs by omission or commission of federal, state, and local governments are damaging manufacturing more than any foreign competitor and adding at least 22.4% to the cost of doing business from the United States. Once these underlying cost pressures are understood, it becomes clear why much U.S. production is moving offshore. In fact, the report asserts the absolute value of the excessive cost burden on the U.S. manufacturers almost as large as the total raw cost index for China. It's based upon their costs, just the cost of it, you see. The NAM highlights 5 critical obstacles to economic recovery in the manufacturing sector: excessive corporate taxation, escalating costs of health and pension benefits, escalating costs of actual or threatening tort litigation. That's when you have to have a lawyer. Escalating compliance costs for regulatory mandates, particularly these related to workplace safety, pollution abatement, and corporate governments, and rising energy costs, particularly natural gas. It's interesting that when I'm talking about this here, folks, that our country now brings in foreign companies to sell their cars. How many companies have come here to the United States in the last 25 years? In other words, they've come here, but they're operating as a foreign company. So what happens simply is in South Carolina, there's BMW here, okay? They pay pretty good wages here, okay? I've heard this from someone. But we have Mercedes-Benz has come here. We have, what's the other companies? Toyota's here. I think Toyota's have 3 or 4 factories here, if not more. Nissan has factories here. At one time, I think Mitsubishi had a plant here in Illinois somewhere or Wisconsin. All these companies are coming in here and they don't have to pay any taxes, folks. They don't have to pay any property taxes. And then the state provides what I call the training of these employees, so they don't have to pay that. You see what's going on here? They're pounding what I call, there's some bad companies out there. I know that. But the majority are trying to make it, especially in the textile and furniture industry, which is gone, folks. It's been destroyed. Go to the state of South Carolina, North Carolina, and see what happens here. And the government created the problem. Oh, yeah, I remember. Oh, yeah, that's right. I'm here from the government. I'm here to help you. Bullshit. You're here to steal and kill and hurt people's lives. Of these factors, the cost of regular compliance is the most legal. Compliance costs for regulation can be regarded as a silent killer of manufacturer competitiveness, asserts NAM. Often developed without an objective cost-benefit analysis, regulations have steadily increased in quantity and complexity regarding which political party controls the executive branch. A reasonable estimate of the costs inflicted by economic, environmental, workplace, and tax compliance regulations is in the order of $850 billion, which is $160 billion on manufacturing alone, equivalent to 12% excise tax on manufacturing production. Economist Clyde Wayne Cruz Jr. of Cato Institute points out that the U.S. regulatory costs exceeds the output of many entire national economies. U.S. regulatory costs exceeds the entire 2000 GDP of Canada, which stood at $701 billion. The regulatory burden also exceeds Mexico's GDP of $574 billion. Estimated federal regulatory costs also exceeds the total of pre-tax corporate profits in 2001, which was $699 billion. With U.S. regulatory costs exceeding in the gross domestic policy of both our NAFTA partners, that is Canada and Mexico, and dwarfing total corporate profits, it's not surprising that overburdened American businesses would be driven abroad in search of more business-friendly environments. Regulatory costs on small business are often referred to as a hidden tax, but the particular tax has a hidden and devastating ripple effect. As cheaper foreign goods become more available, an increasing number of Americans simply forgo paying the hidden costs of government regulation by choosing less expensive imports. That's what they do. They're trying to make it themselves, but they're also shooting themselves in the foot. This makes economic sense to consumers, at least in the short term, but it also contributes to the outsourcing of production and jobs to other countries, which in turn undermines our national long-term economic health. The fourth branch of government, that is, the federal regulatory apparatus, is often described as the fourth branch of government. In fact, as economic commentator Warren L. Maffurin observes, the regulatory agency composed entirely separate and independent government, completely with legislative, executive, and judicial power. Unelected and unaccountable regulators not only devise their own laws, but also empowered to enforce their own laws or rules as acts of accuser against violators and function as judge and jury in cases involving their own rules. As the foregoing cost estimates illustrate, the fourth branch also imposes taxes. Economist Cruz referred to regulations as off-budget taxation, one of the three methods used by the federal government to pay the cost of its programs. The first two obviously are direct taxing and borrowing, which contribute to inflation, which is a particularly insidious form of indirect taxation. That's correct. That's what we're experiencing right now with the dollar. Through regulations, rather than paying directly and booking the expense of new initiative, government can require that private sector and lower level government pay. That process sometimes allows Congress to escape accountability and to blame agencies for costs. This process has also produced a shadow government within our nation that combines legislative, executive, and judicial power. James Madison in the Federalist Papers, Essay 47, warned that combining these functions in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. To this indictment of the fourth branch must be added the recognition that this illegitimate, unaccountable shadow government exercising taxing powers at least equal to that of the legitimate national government, another factor driving business abroad in our nation's out-of-control system of tort litigation. In 2001, the cost of U.S. tort system climbed to $205 billion. And you know who benefits from this? Lawyers are just over 2% of the gross domestic product. Comments to the NAM report at least one-third of the risk increase has been due to an upward reassessment of liabilities associated with asbestos claims. Asbestos litigation was an outgrowth of the 1986 Hazard Emergency Response Act, signed into law by Mr. President Ronald Reagan, requiring the removal of asbestos in public school buildings. 3 years later, the EPA issued a regulatory effective banning most use of asbestos in both public and private buildings by 1997. Granted, asbestos does pose a public health risk, albeit a relatively moderate one. Constant exposure to significant levels of inhalable asbestos dust can contribute to grave respiratory ailments, including cancer. Those risks were dramatically increased by federal policy mandating the removal of asbestos, you see, which dispersed large quantities of asbestos in the air at each affected site. Notes in the analysis Michael Fiumato, the risk of disease from asbestos in building is close to zero. But when you tear it apart, that's when you create the problem. However, a manufacturer, for instance, that exaggerated the risk of asbestos, that's an expensive and counterproductive national drive to remove it from buildings. A campaign that also whetted the destructive appetite of the tort litigation industry. You see, got to make that money. Got to make that money, lawyer. The economic damage inflicted by the Leviathan is hardly limited to asbestos abatement. The NAM points out that pollution abatement falls disproportionately on the shoulders of manufacturers who account for 83% of pollution abatement expenditures in 1999. On a trade-weighted basis, observe the report, the burden of pollution abatement expenditure alone reduces U.S. cost competitiveness by at least 3.5% points. Of our 9 largest economic competitors, only South Korea spends more on pollution abatement as a percentage of GDP. This is true even of the so-called green economies of the European Union. Congressional avocation. Regulation is a particular insidious and destructive form of taxation. It's almost always imposed by faceless, unaccountable bureaucrats rather than being passed by congressmen who must face the voters and pay the political price of their decisions. As Economics Cruz points out, whatever measure Congress uses to address the regulatory state, dealing with the root of the problem requires ending excessive delegation or regulation without representation. Congress should not have bureaucrats to blame for regulatory excesses that is Congress' fault. During the late 1990s, proposals were made to require Congress to okay significant agency rules via a expedient process before they are binding. Cruz continues, Article 1 of the Constitution grants legislative power solely to Congress. In that vein, major agency regulations should be turned into bills requiring congressional passage and a presidential signature, no more or less than ordinary legislation. Sensible regulatory policy, as well as constitutional government, demands that every elected representative be on record for significant, costly regulations. Some might complain their voting on regulations would bog down Congress, but do we want Washington making so many laws that lawmakers can't even pass them all during their working hours or waking hours? Actually, having Congress get bogged down in the process of enacting new regulation would be a very desirable outcome. The longer Congress takes to pass such bills, the likely they will wither and die before becoming laws. Fewer laws means a reduction in the hidden tax that is suffocating our business economy and steadily undermining our standard of living. As Congress actually assumes the burden it has unconsciously delegated to unaccountable bureaucrats, politicians will start absorbing the political costs of regulating productive citizens, which should mean radical reductions in the size and expense of the regulatory state. Unfortunately, as we will see, our domestic regulatory economy continues its relentless assault on our national wealth, even as a vast apparatus of international regulations is being constructed behind the facade of free trade. So that's the end of chapter 2. So what is happening here? We are destroying our own selves. We have lost our wits, you see. We are actually destroying our own selves by all these regulations. And the West is doing it. And yes, they have to compete, yes. But again, when Woodrow Wilson, there was no income tax, folks. There was no income tax before Woodrow Wilson. And what Woodrow Wilson did, I want you to understand, because he's the one that opened up the cookie box here and has destroyed our country. The import tax that protected our American industries or companies or whatever it was at that time, even farming, was what the country paid for, what it had money for to run this country. That's what it was about. There was no sense in having what you call an income tax, and that's what he did, which is a communist socialist idea that Woodrow Wilson pushed, which is progressivism. And this is all this idea simply is now I live in the state of South Carolina, and I know that there's a local there. I think the tax here is either 6% or 7%, and then there's another 3% that's added locally that people have actually volunteered wanting. They improved it. They want more taxes. How stupid can you be? So if I go to a restaurant and it's in the city here, I'm paying 9 to 10% on that food. So let's say here, I get $1 worth of food. Well, roughly 10%, 9% is almost $1. And if I go out to a restaurant, I'm not only going to have to pay extra for that, but I'm going to also have to pay a tip. You see. So this doesn't make any sense at all, unless it goes into government coffers, which they waste because there's no accountability, you see. It's really sad in the situation that we're in. There is no foreign entity that's destroying our country, folks. It is a Trojan horse. It's been going on for a long time. Like I said, going all the way back to Woodrow Wilson. How in the world would you do that? And he put it all on with the people. You see. But he was also probably blackmailed because he was actually seeing another woman. And I believe that's what they used against him, part of it. He was a married man who was seeing another woman. And in those days, that would have got you in big time trouble. So I'm sure he was blackmailed because of that. He also owed some money to Princeton, and they paid it off for him. And he said, well, what do I need to do for that? And they said, well, that's okay. You just wait. We need it. We'll get to the point. We'll get to you. You see. Colonel Mandro House really played Woodrow Wilson to a T. He really did. You see, Woodrow Wilson's ego was a problem. He wanted to impress people, you see, and they saw that in him real quick. So anyway, thank you for being here. I hope that you enjoyed the broadcast I'm sharing with you. We'll get to another particular chapter another time. And again, thank you for watching it. And I appreciate you understanding what's going on. I am simply spreading seed out. Basically, in some ways, I feel desperate here in some ways because most people are completely uneducated and unaware of what's going on. They don't have the resources to even to study themselves this kind of information. And they need someone to stand against what I call the robberies taking place in this country with people. So thank you. Have a good night and take care.